While reading my son's will, my daughter-in-law hissed ominously, "You won't get anything out of the 70 million." The lawyer read the will. Not a word about me, only her triumph. But suddenly a man ran into the room and shouted, "Don't believe them, it's a conspiracy." My daughter-in-law began to get nervous, her face contorted. You won't believe what happened 5 minutes later. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The phone rang sharp through the afternoon silence, cutting through my peaceful Tuesday like a blade through silk. I set down the Tribune's business section and reached for the receiver, expecting another telemarketer or maybe Jimmy calling about our weekend golf plans. "Mr. Bennett, this is Dr. Richardson from Northwestern Memorial." The voice carried that careful, professional tone doctors perfect for delivering terrible news. "I'm sorry to inform you, but your son Ronald passed away today at 1:15 p.m. The newspaper slipped from my lap, pages scattering across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves. My hand gripped the receiver so tight my knuckles went white. "Passed away." The words bounced around my skull without landing anywhere that made sense. What do you mean, passed away?" My voice sounded foreign, smaller than it should. "He was responding to treatment. You said the new protocol was working." "Sir, I understand this is shocking. The cancer had spread more aggressively than we anticipated. He went peacefully, with minimal pain. I'm truly sorry for your loss." Minimal pain, as if that mattered now. As if anything mattered now. The grandfather clock in the corner kept ticking its steady rhythm, oblivious to the fact that my world had just collapsed. Through the window, cars moved down Oak Park Avenue like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I hung up without saying goodbye and stared at the silent phone. Ronald was gone. My brilliant, stubborn, idealistic son who'd built a tech empire from his garage was gone. The boy who'd once spent 3 hours explaining why capitalism needed ethical guidelines was gone. My legs felt unsteady as I stood. I needed to call Vivian. She had to know. Maybe she could explain this away, tell me the doctor was wrong, that this was all some horrible mistake. I dialed her number with shaking fingers. It rang twice before her voice answered, bright and casual. "Marvin? This is unexpected?" I could hear salon noise in the background. Hairdryers humming, women chattering. She was getting her nails done while her husband lay dying. "Vivian, I just got a call from Dr. Richardson." My throat felt raw. "About Ronald?" The background noise suddenly seemed louder, more obscene. How could she be at a spa when our son was fighting for his life? When our son was... Yes, he's dead. Her voice cut through my thoughts like a scalpel, clinical and cold. And before you start with your grieving father routine, let me make something crystal clear. You won't get a penny of the 70 million. Everything Ronald had is mine now. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. She knew. She'd known he was dead and hadn't called me, hadn't called his father. And her first thought, her only thought, was money. Are you serious right now?" Heat flooded my chest, pushing up through my throat. "My son just died, and you're talking about money?" "My husband just died," she corrected, her tone sharp as broken glass. "And unlike you, I understand what that means, legally. Ronald's will is very clear about who inherits what." The afternoon shadows had grown longer while we'd been talking. The house felt different now. Emptier, like all the air had been sucked out. Photos of Ronald at various ages stared down at me from the mantel. Graduation day, his wedding, the last Christmas before his diagnosis, when he'd still looked healthy. "How can you be so cold?" I whispered into the phone. "How can you be so naive?" she shot back. "This is the real world, Marvin. Money doesn't wait for grief." I stared at the receiver after she hung up, listening to the dial tone. In the span of 20 minutes, I'd lost my son and discovered the true nature of the woman he'd married. The woman who'd stood beside him in churches and hospitals, who'd promised to love him in sickness and in health. The clock kept ticking. Traffic kept moving outside, and somewhere in a cold hospital room, my son lay still while his widow calculated her inheritance at a nail salon. I set the phone down carefully and looked around my empty house. Tomorrow there would be funeral arrangements and lawyers and all the brutal machinery of death. Tonight there was just this crushing silence and the terrible knowledge that the woman who'd taken my son's name had never deserved it. My finger hovered over the redial button. Rage was building in my chest, hot and purposeful. Vivian thought she could dismiss me, dismiss Ronald's memory, with her talk of wills and money. She was about to learn otherwise. My finger pressed redial with deliberate force. The rage had settled into something harder now, more focused. Grief could wait. This couldn't. The phone rang once before she answered, her voice still carrying that casual confidence. "What now, Marvin? How dare you think about money when my son just died?" The words exploded out of me, years of watching her manipulate Ronald compressed into pure fury. "How dare you?" "Your son was my husband," she interrupted, voice rising to match mine. "And everything he built, everything he earned, everything he suffered for, it's all mine now, not yours, mine." I paced across the living room, my free hand clenching and unclenching. The photos on the mantel watched me like silent witnesses. Ronald at 10, gap-toothed and proud of his science fair trophy. Ronald, at 25, arm around Vivian on their wedding day, both of them glowing with what I'd foolishly believed was love. "You didn't even call me," I said, my voice dropping to something darker. "Your husband died, and you went to get your nails done instead of calling his father." "I had appointments." Her tone was dismissive, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "Besides, what was the point? You would have just rushed to the hospital and made a scene. I handled it professionally." "Professionally?" I stopped pacing. "He was your husband, not a business transaction." "Everything is a business transaction, Marvin. That's something you never taught him, but life did. Ronald learned to think like a businessman in the end. That's why his will is so comprehensive." There it was again. The will. She kept coming back to it like a vulture circling carrion. I thought about Ronald during his final months, how withdrawn he'd become, how he'd stopped taking my calls as often. I'd attributed it to the cancer, the treatments, the depression that comes with facing mortality. But maybe it had been something else. Maybe he'd finally seen through her mask. "You couldn't even pretend to grieve for 5 minutes," I said. "Grief is a luxury I can't afford. Do you have any idea how much debt the treatments left us in? How much money we spent on experimental procedures and private doctors and flying to Switzerland for some miracle cure that didn't work?" Her voice was getting shriller. "I sacrificed everything for him, and now I'm going to collect what I'm owed." "What you're owed?" The words tasted bitter. "You abandoned him. I saw how often you visited during chemotherapy. I counted the days between your hospital appearances. I was protecting our assets. Someone had to think practically while you and Ronald were playing out some tragic father-son fantasy. Someone had to ensure there would be something left when the medical bills were paid." The line went quiet, except for our breathing. Through the window, I watched a neighbor walking his dog. The ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon, continuing while my world burned down. That dog probably showed more loyalty than the woman on the other end of this call. "You never loved him," I said finally. "Love doesn't pay bills, Marvin. Love doesn't secure futures. Love is what naive people believe in before life teaches them better." Her voice had gone cold again, surgical. "Ronald figured that out, eventually. Why do you think he rewrote his will 3 times in the last year?" The words hit like a physical blow. 3 times. Ronald had been planning something, changing something, and I'd been completely unaware. How many conversations had I missed? How many signs had I ignored while focusing on treatment schedules and doctor appointments? "You're a monster," I whispered. "I'm a realist. And tomorrow at the funeral, you'll see exactly how realistic I can be." "Don't even think about challenging me, old man. I have lawyers you can't afford, and documentation you can't dispute." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding the dead phone, my ears ringing with her words. The house felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Outside, the neighbor had disappeared around the corner with his dog, leaving the street empty. I slammed the phone down hard enough to make the end table shake. A photo of Ronald's college graduation fell over, and I reached out to straighten it automatically. His young face smiled up at me, full of hope and certainty about the future. He'd been so proud that day, so eager to change the world through technology and ethical business practices. The silence stretched out around me, heavy and expectant. Tomorrow I would have to face her again in public while we buried my son. She would stand there in expensive black, playing the grieving widow while calculating her windfall. She would accept condolences from people who had no idea what she really was. But tonight, in this quiet house full of memories, I made a promise to that young man in the graduation photo. Vivian Bennett thought she had won. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains like it had every day for the past 15 years, but today everything felt different. I lay still for a moment, letting yesterday's reality settle into my bones again. Ronald was gone. Vivian had shown her true colors, and today I would have to face both truths in public. I sat up slowly, joints protesting the movement. Sleep had been elusive, filled with fragments of phone calls and memories of Ronald as a boy. The house felt impossibly quiet, without the possibility of his weekly check-in calls. No more, "Hey Dad, how's retirement treating you?" No more updates about his latest business ventures or complaints about experimental treatments. The coffee maker gurgled to life on its timer, a small mercy of routine in a world gone sideways. I shuffled to the kitchen, poured a cup, and stood at the window watching Chicago wake up. Traffic was already building on the expressway in the distance. People heading to jobs, to lives that hadn't been shattered by a phone call yesterday afternoon. My black suit hung in the closet like a uniform for grief. The last time I'd worn it was for Margaret's funeral 3 years ago. The fabric felt heavier now as I lifted it out, weighted with the memory of standing graveside while rain drummed on the umbrella above my head. Margaret would have known what to do about Vivian. She'd always been better at reading people, better at seeing through polished surfaces to the rot beneath. I dressed carefully, adjusting the tie until it sat properly. The mirror reflected a man I barely recognized. Older, grayer, with new lines around the eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Grief aged you instantly, I was learning. One phone call and suddenly you looked every one of your 68 years. The photo albums were stacked in the living room bookshelf, and I found myself pulling out the most recent one. Ronald's illness was documented there in brutal honesty. The gradual weight loss, the way his smile became more forced as treatments failed, the hollow look that settled into his eyes during the final months. But there were also photos of his determination, his refusal to give up, the way he'd kept working even when the cancer tried to steal his strength. Millions of dollars had gone into keeping him alive. Experimental treatments in Germany, clinical trials in Houston, a last-ditch surgery in Boston that had bought him 3 extra months. I'd paid for some of it. Ronald's insurance and business accounts had covered the rest, and Vivian had complained about every penny spent. "We're hemorrhaging money," she'd said during one particularly brutal chemo cycle. "At what point do we accept reality?" Reality, her favorite word, as if love and hope were luxuries only fools could afford. I closed the album and set it back on the shelf. The photos showed something else too, something I'd been too focused on medical reports to notice at the time. In the later pictures, Ronald rarely looked at Vivian directly. When she was in frame at all, there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before his diagnosis. Maybe he'd started seeing through her performance. Maybe that was what she'd meant about him rewriting his will 3 times. The funeral was at 2 o'clock, St. Matthew's Episcopal, the same church where Ronald and Vivian had been married 5 years ago. I'd walked him down the aisle that day, proud and hopeful about his future. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I packed a small bag with essentials and checked my watch. 11:30. Enough time to drive there slowly, maybe stop by the cemetery to see the plot we'd selected. Ronald would be buried next to his mother, in the Bennett family section that went back 4 generations. Vivian would have preferred something more expensive, more ostentatious, but the will Ronald had written before his illness specified exactly where he wanted to rest. At least he'd gotten that right. The garage door rumbled open, and I backed the Buick out into the morning sunshine. Oak Park looked peaceful at this hour. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, the kind of neighborhood where people still waved to each other and borrowed cups of sugar. Ronald had grown up here, learned to ride his bike on these sidewalks, built his first computer in the basement workshop. As I drove toward the expressway, my hands gripped the steering wheel, tighter than necessary. Today I would face Vivian in front of friends, colleagues, and extended family. She would play the grieving widow perfectly, accepting sympathy while mentally cataloging who might be worth cultivating for future business relationships. She would expect me to play along, to maintain the fiction of family unity for appearances. She was going to be disappointed. The traffic moved steadily toward downtown, carrying me toward whatever confrontation awaited. In the rearview mirror, Oak Park grew smaller, but my resolve grew stronger. Vivian thought she'd won by default, that money and lawyers made her untouchable. She was about to learn that some battles couldn't be bought, and some fathers would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their son's memory. The city skyline rose ahead of me, gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere in that maze of steel and glass, Vivian was probably getting ready too, choosing jewelry expensive enough to signal her new wealth, but tasteful enough to avoid criticism, calculating even in her grief performance. But calculation worked both ways, and I'd had all night to think about mine. I backed out of the driveway slowly, my hands steadier now than they'd been since yesterday's phone call. The morning sun slanted through the oak trees lining Forest Avenue, casting familiar shadows across pavement I'd driven thousands of times. But today felt different. Today I was driving toward war. The route to Graceland Cemetery was etched in my memory, down Harlem Avenue to the Eisenhower, then east toward the city. Traffic moved in its predictable rhythm, commuters heading to offices where they'd complain about meetings and deadlines, normal problems, problems that seemed insignificant when measured against burying your son and facing his calculating widow. A medical office building flashed past on my right, its glass facade reflecting the morning light. The sight triggered something sharp in my chest. How many times had I driven Ronald to similar buildings over the past 18 months? How many waiting rooms had we sat in together while Vivian claimed she had prior commitments? I remembered the third chemotherapy session most clearly. Ronald had asked me to drive him because Vivian was getting her hair colored while her husband fought poison with poison, while his body tried to reject the cure that might save his life. I'd sat in that sterile waiting room for 4 hours, watching other families support their loved ones, while wondering where my daughter-in-law had learned such casual cruelty. "Dad, you don't have to stay," Ronald had said when they finally wheeled him out, pale and shaking from the treatment, but his eyes said something different. His eyes said he needed his father because his wife couldn't be bothered to show up. The memory made my jaw clench as I merged onto I-90. A sleek BMW passed me in the left lane, and I found myself wondering if it was similar to the one I'd seen Vivian getting into last month outside the Palmer House Hotel. She'd told Ronald she was meeting with estate planners, but estate planners didn't usually require afternoon meetings at luxury hotels, and they certainly didn't require the kind of intimate body language I'd witnessed from my parking spot across the street. I'd followed her that day, something I'd never imagined myself doing, but something about her excuses had started wearing thin, especially when Ronald's condition was deteriorating, and she seemed more concerned with her social calendar than his treatment schedule. The man she'd met was tall, silver-haired, expensive suit. They'd embraced like lovers, not lawyer and client, and when they'd gone upstairs together, I'd understood exactly what kind of planning was taking place. Luther Hayes. I'd looked him up later, a lawyer, but not the kind who specialized in estate planning, the kind who specialized in getting rich wives out of inconvenient marriages, the kind who probably charged by the hour for more than legal advice. The city skyline grew larger ahead of me, steel and glass towers reaching toward a cloudless sky. Ronald had always loved that view, even as a child. He'd press his face against the car window during family trips downtown, counting skyscrapers and imagining the businesses housed inside them. "Someday I'll have an office up there, Dad," he'd said once, and he had. 37th floor of the Willis Tower, before the cancer made climbing even small hills a challenge. But the memory that hurt most was our last real conversation. 3 weeks before he died, he'd called me at home, his voice weak but purposeful. "Dad, I need you to know something," he'd said, "about Vivian, about what's been happening. Son, you don't need to worry about... No, listen. I know what she's been doing, who she's been seeing." His voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical illness. "I've known for months. I'm taking care of it, though. I'm taking care of everything." I'd wanted to ask more, to offer comfort or advice, but Ronald had changed the subject to my garden and his mother's old rose bushes. Now I understood why. He'd been protecting me even then, shielding me from the full scope of Vivian's betrayal, while he put his own affairs in order. 3 times he'd rewritten his will, Vivian had said. 3 times in his final year. What had he discovered? What had he changed? And why did she seem so confident about inheriting everything if he'd known about her affair? The cemetery gates came into view ahead, wrought iron and limestone marking the entrance to one of Chicago's most prestigious burial grounds. I'd purchased plots there years ago, back when death seemed like a distant concern. Margaret rested there now, and soon Ronald would join her in the Bennett family section. But first, I had to survive whatever performance Vivian had planned for today. She'd want to play the grieving widow for the crowd, accepting condolences while mentally calculating her windfall. She'd expect me to play along, to maintain family dignity for appearances. She was going to be disappointed. Again. I pulled into the parking area and killed the engine. Across the lot, I spotted Vivian's silver Porsche, a car she'd insisted on buying while Ronald was spending his savings on experimental treatments. She was already here, probably holding court near the entrance, accepting sympathy while wearing her grief like expensive jewelry. My hands gripped the steering wheel one final time. Yesterday, she'd shown me her true nature over the phone. Today, she'd tried to humiliate me in public, but she'd underestimated something important about the man she was dealing with. I wasn't just a grieving father anymore. I was a father with a mission. I stepped out of the Buick and straightened my black jacket, scanning the gathering crowd near the cemetery entrance. Early mourners clustered in small groups, their voices subdued against the morning air. And there, positioned like a queen holding court, stood Vivian. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a sleek black dress that managed to be both funeral appropriate and figure flattering, paired with jewelry that caught the sunlight just enough to signal wealth. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged, her makeup flawless. She looked like a woman preparing for a photo shoot, not burying her husband. The moment she spotted me walking across the gravel lot, her face transformed. The practiced grief expression melted away, replaced by something predatory. She excused herself from a group of Ronald's former colleagues and strode toward me with deliberate purpose. "Well, well, look who decided to show up." Her voice carried across the space between us, loud enough for nearby mourners to hear. "I hope you're not expecting anything after today, Marvin. The lawyers will make everything very clear." Several people turned at her words, their faces registering surprise at the hostile tone. This wasn't how family members typically addressed each other at funerals, but Vivian either didn't notice or didn't care about the audience she was creating. "I'm here to bury my son," I said quietly, trying to maintain some dignity despite her public attack. Nothing more. "Your son?" She laughed, the sound sharp and unnatural in the cemetery setting. "Ronald outgrew you years ago, old man. He built an empire while you played with property deals in the suburbs. He didn't need his daddy's advice or approval." More heads turned now. Ronald's business associates looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. His former secretary, a kind woman named Patricia, actually stepped backward as if trying to escape the confrontation. "Show some respect," I said, my voice still controlled but with an edge creeping in. "This is your husband's funeral." "Respect?" Vivian's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Like the respect you showed when you questioned every medical decision? Like the respect you showed when you insisted on those expensive treatments that bankrupted us?" Her voice rose higher, drawing more attention. "Ronald finally had peace in his last weeks because I convinced him to stop listening to your false hope." The words hit like physical blows. She was rewriting history, making it sound like I'd been the one prolonging Ronald's suffering, making it sound like she'd been the voice of compassion while I'd been the unrealistic optimist demanding pointless procedures. "That's not what happened," I said, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Isn't it?" She stepped closer, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the power. "Tell me, Marvin, when was the last time Ronald actually asked for your opinion about anything important? When was the last time he called you first with good news or bad news?" The questions stung because they contained just enough truth to wound. Ronald had been pulling away in his final months, but I'd attributed it to his illness, his struggle with mortality. I'd never considered that his wife might be poisoning him against his own father. "You're pathetic," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to a hiss that only I could hear while maintaining her public performance. "A useless old man clinging to relevance through his son's achievements. Well, guess what? Your son is dead, and you're nobody now. Nobody." The funeral director appeared at my elbow, his professional smile strained with obvious discomfort. "Perhaps we should move toward the ceremony area," he suggested diplomatically. "The service will begin shortly." Vivian straightened her dress and smiled brilliantly at the man. "Of course. We're all eager to celebrate Ronald's life and legacy." She turned back to me with mock sweetness. "Aren't we, Marvin? So eager to hear about the wonderful life Ronald built. Without you." She walked away with practiced grace, immediately rejoining her audience of mourners who'd witnessed enough of the exchange to know something was deeply wrong. But they couldn't know the full scope of her cruelty, the calculated way she'd chosen every word to inflict maximum damage. I stood there for a moment, breathing carefully through my nose, trying to regain my composure. The funeral director lingered beside me, clearly uncertain whether further intervention might be necessary. "Family tensions," I said quietly, offering him a reassuring nod. "Grief affects people differently." But as I watched Vivian accept condolences from people who had no idea what she really was, I made a silent promise. She thought she'd won the opening round with her public humiliation. She thought she could reduce me to a broken old man stumbling through his son's funeral. She was about to learn that some battles were fought over years, not minutes, and some fathers would endure any humiliation to protect their child's memory. The ceremony area beckoned ahead, where I would have to sit through 90 minutes of Vivian's performance, while she systematically tried to destroy what remained of my dignity. But I would endure it, because somewhere in Ronald's carefully rewritten will, somewhere in his final plans, lay the justice I couldn't deliver myself. I just had to survive long enough to see it. The ceremony chairs were arranged in neat rows facing Ronald's photograph, a professional portrait from better days when his face still carried hope instead of the hollow exhaustion cancer had carved there. Mourners filed toward their seats with the careful solemnity appropriate for such occasions, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact. Vivian positioned herself with strategic precision, choosing a seat in the second row where she could maintain her widow's prominence while ensuring she sat directly behind me, close enough to continue her whispered campaign of destruction throughout the service. I took my place in the front row, focusing on my son's image, rather than the woman settling herself like a vulture behind my right shoulder. The funeral director made final adjustments to the flower arrangements, expensive displays that Vivian had undoubtedly chosen for their visual impact rather than their meaning. The service began with the minister's gentle words about celebration of life and eternal rest, standard phrases professionally delivered, meaningless in the face of losing a child. I tried to concentrate on memories of Ronald, his excitement over his first computer, his pride when his business went public, his determination to fight an unbeatable disease. "Such a shame Ronald never got to enjoy his success," Vivian whispered directly into my ear, her voice so low only I could hear it. "All that money he made, all those achievements, and he spent his last months worrying about disappointing his father." I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted, but my hands clenched tighter in my lap. "He told me near the end that he felt guilty," she continued, her breath warm against my neck in a mockery of intimacy. "Guilty for not being the son you wanted, for not including you in his business decisions, for growing beyond your small-town real estate mentality." Patricia, Ronald's former secretary, stood to deliver a eulogy about his kindness as an employer. She spoke about his commitment to ethical business practices, his insistence on treating employees like family. As she described the man I'd raised, Vivian leaned forward again. "Of course, she never saw how he really felt about family obligations," she murmured. "How exhausted he was by your constant need for attention, your pathetic attempts to stay relevant in his adult life." My jaw clenched, involuntarily. The woman sitting to my left glanced over with concern, clearly sensing tension but unable to identify its source. I forced myself to relax my posture to maintain the appearance of dignified grief while poison dripped into my ear. Another speaker took the podium, Jimmy Caldwell, Ronald's old college roommate and business partner. He talked about Ronald's integrity, his loyalty to friends, his refusal to compromise his principles even when it cost him profitable deals. Words that painted the picture of a man I'd been proud to call my son. "Funny how Jimmy doesn't mention Ronald's biggest compromise," Vivian whispered, pretending to respect his father's opinions when he'd already decided you were irrelevant. "That took real acting skill, don't you think?" She paused for effect, then delivered her next thrust with surgical precision. "He was relieved when you stopped visiting as often. Told me it was easier to focus on getting well without your constant hovering, without your desperate need to feel useful." The lie was crafted perfectly, containing just enough plausible truth to wound. Ronald had asked me to cut back on visits during his final weeks, but only because the treatments were making him increasingly uncomfortable with company. I'd respected his need for privacy, never suspecting his wife was using my absence to isolate him further. Jimmy finished his remarks and returned to his seat. The minister began reading from Scripture about valleys and shadows, words meant to comfort but falling flat in the face of genuine grief. Other mourners dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Vivian reached across to touch my shoulder in a gesture that would look supportive to observers. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said, her fingers digging into my jacket with false comfort. "Ronald died believing his father loved him. He never realized you just loved the idea of having a successful son to brag about, the reflected glory, the way people looked at you differently when they learned who your son was." My breathing grew shallow. Around us, people shifted in their seats as the service moved toward its conclusion. The minister spoke about resurrection and hope, concepts that felt abstract when your child was the one being buried. "That's why his will is so generous to me," Vivian continued relentlessly. "He knew I loved him for himself, not for what he could do for my reputation, not for the validation he could provide to an aging father desperate to matter." She leaned back then, satisfied with her work. I could hear her adjusting her clothing, preparing for the final phase of her performance. In a few minutes, she would stand and accept condolences with perfect grace, playing the devastated widow while I sat here processing the systematic demolition of my relationship with my son. But as the minister moved toward his closing prayer, I realized something important. Vivian's cruelty was too calculated, too specific. She wasn't just venting grief or striking out randomly. She was working from a script, delivering precisely crafted wounds designed to destroy my confidence before whatever came next, which meant she was afraid of something. Something about today, about the will reading, about information she thought I might possess. Her sustained attack wasn't the behavior of someone completely confident in their position. It was the behavior of someone trying to break their opponent before the real battle began. The service concluded with a benediction and the gentle suggestion that mourners proceed to the graveside. People began standing, gathering purses and adjusting coats. Vivian rose gracefully and immediately began accepting sympathy from nearby attendees, transforming back into the grieving widow with practiced ease. But she'd miscalculated something crucial. She'd assumed her words would leave me broken and defeated. Instead, they'd revealed her desperation, and that knowledge would have to sustain me through whatever came next. Cars pulled away from Graceland Cemetery in a somber procession, but I barely registered the movement around me. The funeral had drained something essential from my core, leaving me hollow as an empty vessel. Vivian's systematic cruelty during the service had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. I felt beaten down, defenseless, ready to accept whatever final humiliation awaited at the lawyer's office. The Willis Tower rose ahead of us like a monument to corporate power, its black glass reflecting the afternoon sun in sharp geometric patterns. 15 minutes of downtown traffic had passed in a blur while I processed the morning's emotional assault. Now we were parking in the underground garage, preparing for the final act of this carefully orchestrated drama. Vivian emerged from her Porsche, looking refreshed rather than grieved, as if the funeral had energized rather than depleted her. She'd reapplied her lipstick and straightened her dress, transforming back into the poised professional woman who'd charmed her way into my son's life 5 years ago. The grieving widow performance was over. Now came the business meeting. Luther Hayes waited for us in the lobby, his silver hair immaculate, and his expensive suit perfectly tailored. He greeted Vivian with the kind of lingering handshake that confirmed everything I'd suspected about their relationship, then offered me a professionally appropriate nod. "My condolences again, Mr. Bennet," he said, his voice carrying just the right amount of sympathy. "I know this is difficult, but we'll make the proceedings as painless as possible." The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt endless. Vivian stood close enough to Luther that their shoulders touched, while I occupied the opposite corner like a defeated old man being escorted to his execution. The floor numbers climbed steadily, 20, 25, 30, each digit marking my progression toward financial ruin. Luther's office occupied a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The conference table was polished mahogany, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Everything about the space screamed success, power, authority, the perfect stage for Vivian's final victory. "Please have a seat wherever you're comfortable," Luther said, gesturing toward the chairs, but Vivian had already positioned herself at his right hand, claiming the seat of honor beside the man who would deliver her prize. I took a chair across the table, isolated like a defendant facing judgment. The will documents lay in a neat stack before Luther, bound in blue folders that gave them official weight. He arranged his reading glasses with theatrical precision, cleared his throat, and assumed the grave expression appropriate for such moments. "Before we begin," Vivian said, her voice honey-sweet with false concern, "I want you to know I hold no grudges, Marvin. Ronald's illness was hard on all of us. I understand if you had expectations about his final wishes." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with anticipation. "But you need to prepare yourself for disappointment. The will is very clear about who inherits the $70 million. Ronald was quite specific about ensuring my financial security after his death." The words hit exactly as intended. My shoulders sagged further. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the chair arms. She was right, of course. Why would Ronald leave anything substantial to his father when he had a young wife to protect? Why would he burden her with the obligation to care for an aging parent? "Shall we proceed?" Luther asked, his voice professionally neutral, but with an undertone of satisfaction. He was about to deliver the performance of his career, reading a document that would make his lover rich, while destroying an old man who'd already lost everything that mattered. I nodded silently beyond speech. Across the table, Vivian's smile grew wider. She'd won completely, first by isolating Ronald from his father, then by humiliating me at his funeral, and now by claiming the fortune that represented my son's life's work. Luther opened the folder with deliberate ceremony, his eyes scanning the first page as if verifying details he'd already memorized. The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of downtown traffic 37 floors below. "This is the last will and testament of Ronald James Bennet," he began formally, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "Dated March 15th, 2025. Vivian's breathing quickened slightly. I closed my eyes, preparing for the final blow that would leave me with nothing but memories of the son who'd apparently forgotten his father in his final months. Luther cleared his throat again, preparing to read the document that would complete my destruction. "I, Ronald James Bennet, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils made by me, and declare this to be my last will and testament." Luther's voice carried perfect authority as he read from the document, each word dropping into the silence like stones into still water. I kept my eyes fixed on my hands, watching them tremble slightly despite my efforts at control. Across the table, Vivian sat perfectly still, but I could feel her satisfaction radiating like heat from a furnace. "To my beloved wife, Vivian Catherine Bennet, who has shown such devoted care during my illness and who deserves financial security in her widowhood, I leave all my assets, properties, and monetary inheritance." Luther paused meaningfully. "This includes my technology company shares, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $70 million. The words crashed over me like a physical blow. $70 million. Everything Ronald had built, everything he'd achieved, flowing to the woman who'd betrayed him while he lay dying, the woman who'd spent his final months planning his funeral and calculating her windfall. Furthermore, Luther continued, his voice growing more confident, I specifically direct that this inheritance not be subject to any family claims or expectations. My wife's financial independence is paramount, and she should feel no obligation to support extended family members who may believe themselves entitled to my estate. Extended family members? The phrase was a knife twisted in the wound. That's how my son had seen me in his final months. Not as the father who'd raised him, not as the man who'd driven him to countless treatments, but as an obligation to be dismissed. Vivian's hand moved to cover her mouth in a gesture of shock, but I caught the flash of triumph in her eyes. She was performing grief while celebrating victory, playing the overwhelmed widow while claiming her prize. There are additional provisions regarding charitable donations and minor bequests, Luther said, flipping through pages with professional efficiency. But the primary inheritance is clear and unambiguous. Mrs. Bennet inherits the entirety of her husband's estate. The conference room felt airless, the windows suddenly seeming more like barriers than openings. Outside, Chicago continued its busy rhythm, people pursuing their lives and dreams while mine collapsed into rubble. Ronald's final judgment had been delivered with legal precision. His father was worth nothing. I need a moment, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Of course, Vivian said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. This must be overwhelming. I know you had hopes. She trailed off delicately, as if sparing my feelings while delivering the final thrust. Luther began organizing his papers with satisfied efficiency. The document has been properly witnessed and notarized. Mrs. Bennet, we can begin the probate process immediately. With an estate this size, there will be some procedural requirements, but nothing complicated. Thank you, Luther, Vivian said warmly. Ronald chose his lawyer well. I'm grateful for your thorough attention to his wishes. The exchange carried undertones that made my stomach turn. Even now, in the moment of their triumph, they couldn't resist subtle references to their collaboration. Luther's thorough attention hadn't been limited to legal documents, and they both knew it. Mr. Bennet, Luther addressed me with professional courtesy tinged with pity, I understand this isn't the outcome you might have hoped for, but I assure you the will is legally binding and reflects your son's considered judgment about his estate. I looked up at him, this silver-haired criminal who'd stolen my son's wife and now his fortune. He really left me nothing? There are small bequests, Luther said, consulting his papers. Some personal items, family photographs, things of sentimental rather than monetary value. But the bulk of the estate. He gestured toward Vivian with apologetic finality. She leaned forward with mock concern. Marvin, I hope you understand this isn't personal. Ronald wanted to ensure my security. He knew I'd given up my career to care for him, that I'd sacrificed my earning potential for his needs. Given up her career, the phrase would have been laughable if it hadn't been so cruel. Her career had consisted of modeling jobs that dried up by her 30s, leaving her hunting for a wealthy husband to support her lifestyle. Ronald had been her salvation, not her sacrifice. The probate process typically takes several months, Luther explained. But given the straightforward nature of this will, we should be able to expedite matters. Mrs. Bennet, you'll have access to immediate funds for expenses, with the full inheritance transferred upon completion. Vivian nodded gracefully. I appreciate your efficiency. Ronald always said you were the most thorough lawyer he'd ever worked with. Always said. Another lie for the pile. Ronald had met Luther through Vivian, had hired him on her recommendation during his illness. The thorough attention had started long before any legal work began. I sat in my chair like a broken man, watching them discuss the dismantling of my son's legacy with professional satisfaction. Everything Ronald had built would flow to his calculating widow, who would probably spend it on luxury vacations and expensive jewelry, while forgetting the man who'd made it possible. The conference room fell quiet as Luther concluded his reading. Outside the windows, afternoon shadows grew longer across the city. Somewhere in those towers and streets, people were building lives and chasing dreams. Mine had just ended in a lawyer's office with the reading of a will that erased me from my son's story. Vivian smiled at me across the polished table, her victory complete. "Well," Vivian said, her voice bright with satisfaction, "I suppose we should discuss the timeline for—" The conference room door burst open with explosive force, slamming against the wall hard enough to rattle the windows. Jimmy Caldwell stood in the doorway, his face flushed from running, his tie askew, clutching a manila envelope against his chest like a shield. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the afternoon quiet like a fire alarm. "Don't sign anything. Don't believe them. It's all lies." Luther shot to his feet, his professional composure cracking. "Mr. Caldwell, this is a private legal proceeding. You can't just—" "Private!" Jimmy stepped into the room, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "There's nothing private about conspiracy and fraud." He pointed directly at Luther and Vivian, his hand shaking with anger. "These two have been planning this for months." Vivian's mouth fell open, her carefully maintained widow's composure dissolving into genuine panic. "Jimmy, what are you talking about? You're clearly upset about Ronald's death, but—" "Upset?" Jimmy's voice rose higher, filling the corporate conference room with raw emotion. "I'm upset that you've been screwing this crooked lawyer while my best friend was dying. I'm upset that you forged his will. I'm upset that you're trying to steal everything he worked for." The words hit the room like grenades, each accusation exploding against the polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows. Luther had gone pale, his silver hair suddenly looking less distinguished and more desperate. Vivian gripped her chair arms so tightly her knuckles had turned white. That's an outrageous accusation," Luther stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Mr. Caldwell, you're clearly distraught." "Distraught?" Jimmy laughed bitterly, advancing toward the conference table. "You want to know what's distraught? Ronald calling me 3 weeks before he died, telling me about the private investigator he'd hired, telling me about the photos of you two at the Palmer House Hotel, telling me how his loving wife was planning to steal his fortune the moment he stopped breathing." I felt something shift inside my chest, a spark of hope fighting against the crushing weight of despair. Jimmy's words were landing with the force of truth, each detail too specific to be fabrication. "You're lying," Vivian said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "Ronald never suspected anything. He trusted me completely." "Trusted you?" Jimmy pulled a photograph from his envelope and slammed it onto the conference table. "Then explain this picture of you and lover boy here in a hotel room last month. Explain the credit card records showing lunch dates while Ronald was getting chemotherapy. Explain the phone records showing 2-hour conversations with Luther while your husband was fighting for his life." Luther lurched forward, reaching for the photograph, but Jimmy snatched it back. "Don't even think about it, counselor. I've got copies of everything. Bank records, hotel receipts, phone logs, and most importantly—" He held up a sealed envelope with trembling fingers. "A copy of Ronald's real will, the one he wrote after he found out about your affair." The silence that followed was deafening. Through the windows, Chicago sprawled in afternoon sunlight, oblivious to the drama playing out 37 floors above the street. But inside this conference room, the carefully constructed world of lies was collapsing with devastating precision. "That's impossible," Vivian whispered. "I watched him write his final will. I was there when he signed it." "You were there when he signed a fake," Jimmy said, his voice dropping to something harder and more dangerous. "He'd already written the real one and hidden it with me, because he knew exactly what kind of woman he'd married. He knew you'd try to steal everything the moment he was too weak to stop you." Luther's professional mask had completely disintegrated. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his hands shook as he tried to organize the fake documents. "This is all speculation. The will I read is properly witnessed, and—" "Witnessed by your secretary and your paralegal," Jimmy interrupted, "both of whom, I'm betting, have no idea they were participating in forgery. Both of whom will sing like birds when the FBI starts asking questions about document fraud and conspiracy." FBI, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Vivian had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out against her pale skin like war paint on a corpse. I found my voice for the first time since Jimmy's explosive entrance. "The real will? What does it say?" Jimmy turned toward me, his expression softening slightly. It says that Ronald loved his father. It says he knew you'd always supported him, even when he was too sick and suspicious to appreciate it. And it says he wanted to make sure justice was served if anything happened to him. The manila envelope in Jimmy's hands suddenly seemed to contain more than legal documents. It contained vindication, justice, and the knowledge that my son hadn't forgotten his father after all. "You can't prove any of this," Vivian said desperately. "Ronald's dead. Whatever you think you know." "I know plenty," Jimmy said quietly. "I know about the fake cancer treatment receipts Luther helped you create to hide the money you were stealing. I know about the offshore accounts you set up in preparation for his death. I know about the life insurance policies you took out without Ronald's knowledge." Each revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just about inheritance fraud. It was about systematic theft from a dying man who'd trusted his wife to care for him. Luther made a sudden movement toward the door, but Jimmy stepped sideways, blocking his escape. "Going somewhere, counselor? I don't think so. We're going to sit right here until the authorities arrive, because I called them from the lobby, and they should be here any minute." The sound of footsteps in the hallway confirmed Jimmy's words. Heavy, purposeful steps that could only belong to law enforcement officers ascending to deliver justice to a room that had seen too much deception. Vivian looked at Luther with desperate eyes, but he was staring at his hands like a man watching his life dissolve. Their conspiracy was unraveling with the speed and inevitability of an avalanche, and somewhere in that manila envelope, my son's true voice was waiting to be heard. "We need independent verification," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all day. Jimmy's revelations had ignited something inside me, transforming shock into determination. "I want a document expert to examine both wills. Now." Luther's face had gone ashen, his silver hair looking less distinguished and more desperate with each passing minute. "Mr. Bennett, that's completely unnecessary. The will I read is properly notarized and—" "Forged," Jimmy interrupted, pulling out his phone. "I already called someone. Dr. Sarah Chen from Northwestern's Forensic Document Lab. She's 5 minutes away." Vivian shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking completely. "This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in here with wild accusations and—" "Watch me," Jimmy said quietly. The office fell silent except for the distant hum of downtown traffic. Luther kept shuffling papers like a man rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship, while Vivian paced near the windows, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor in an agitated rhythm. Dr. Chen arrived with professional efficiency, carrying a leather case that reminded me of a medical bag. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of scientific authority that made Luther visibly nervous. "Mr. Caldwell briefed me on the situation," she said, setting her case on the conference table. "I understand there are questions about document authenticity. May I see the contested will?" Luther hesitated, his hand hovering over the blue folder. "I'm not sure this is legally appropriate without proper—" "Hand it over," I said, my patience finally exhausted, "unless you have something to hide." Dr. Chen examined the document with methodical precision, using magnifying equipment and specialized lighting from her case. Her expression remained neutral, but I caught her eyebrows rising slightly as she studied the signature area. "Interesting," she murmured, making notes on a tablet. "The ink composition appears inconsistent with the paper date. And this signature?" She looked up at Luther with sharp eyes. "When exactly did you witness this document being signed?" "March 15th, Luther said automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, that's the date listed on the—" "The ink analysis suggests this signature was made no earlier than last week," Dr. Chen said calmly. "Possibly within the last few days. Would you care to explain that discrepancy?" Vivian's pacing stopped abruptly. Luther's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, clearly searching for an explanation that wouldn't incriminate him further. "There's more," Jimmy said, producing a sealed envelope from his jacket. "Ronald gave me this 3 weeks before he died. His real will, witnessed by his doctor and his accountant, both men who had no reason to lie." Dr. Chen examined the envelope seal with professional interest. "This appears intact. The paper stock is different from the questioned document, and the age characteristics are consistent with the claim date." "We need to verify its contents," I said. Is there a way to access Ronald's bank records? He mentioned keeping important documents in his safety deposit box. Jimmy nodded. I have authorization. Ronald made me a backup executor specifically for this situation. He suspected Vivian might try something after he died. The trip to First National took 15 minutes, our unlikely procession moving through downtown Chicago like a legal parade. Dr. Chen rode with me, her equipment case secured in my back seat, while Jimmy followed in his Honda. Vivian and Luther brought up the rear in her Porsche, both looking like condemned prisoners being escorted to their execution. The bank manager, a nervous man named Peterson, verified Jimmy's authorization with multiple phone calls and computer checks. Ronald had indeed named Jimmy as backup executor, with specific instructions that his safety deposit box be opened in case of suspected document fraud. Your son was very thorough, Peterson told me as we descended to the vault level. He updated these instructions just 6 weeks ago during his final office visit. The safety deposit box contained exactly what Jimmy had promised, a sealed envelope marked Final Will and Testament in Ronald's careful handwriting, along with a separate letter addressed to me personally. Dr. Chen supervised the opening process, documenting everything with photographs and careful chain of custody procedures. As she broke the seal on the will envelope, Vivian made one last, desperate attempt. Whatever that says, it doesn't matter, she said, her voice cracking with strain. Ronald was on heavy medication toward the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. Actually, Dr. Chen said, examining the document, this will was prepared and executed according to Illinois state law requirements, properly witnessed, notarized, and legally binding. She looked up at me with something approaching a smile. Mr. Bennett, would you like to know what your son really wanted? I nodded, afraid to trust my voice. Across the small vault room, Vivian's face had gone completely white. Luther stood frozen, probably calculating his chances of fleeing the country before the criminal charges were filed. I think, Dr. Chen said, we should return to the office for a proper reading. This document deserves the same formal respect that was given to the forgery. As we walked back toward the elevators, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Tuesday afternoon. Hope, real hope, backed by evidence and professional verification. Behind me, I could hear Vivian and Luther whispering desperately to each other, their conspiracy collapsing with each step toward the truth. Back in Luther's conference room, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Dr. Chen sat at the head of the table where Luther had presided over his fraudulent reading, the authentic will spread before her like evidence in a courtroom. I took the seat closest to her, while Jimmy positioned himself across from our defeated conspirators. Vivian looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Her perfect makeup had smudged from nervous touching, and her hands trembled as she gripped her chair arms. Luther stared at his expensive desk as if memorizing it, probably realizing this might be his last day practicing law. This document, Dr. Chen began formally, has been verified as authentic through multiple forensic techniques. The signature is genuine, the witnesses are legitimate, and the execution meets all Illinois legal requirements. She cleared her throat. Mr. Bennett, your son's final will and testament reads as follows. My heart hammered against my ribs as she continued. I, Ronald James Bennett, being of sound mind and having discovered the betrayal of my marriage, do hereby revoke all previous wills. To my beloved father, Marvin Bennett, who supported me through my illness while my wife pursued her own interests, I leave my entire estate valued at approximately $70 million. The words hit Vivian like physical blows. She gasped, then began shaking her head frantically. No, no, that's impossible. Ronald loved me. He wouldn't— There's more, Dr. Chen said, her voice cutting through Vivian's denial. Quote, my wife, Vivian, forfeited any claim to my estate through her adultery with my attorney, Luther Hayes, whom I trusted to handle my affairs honestly. Their betrayal during my illness demonstrates their unfitness to inherit anything I built through honest work. Luther's face had gone gray. Professional ruin was staring him in the face, along with potential criminal charges that could end his career permanently. Dr. Chen continued reading. Furthermore, I direct my father to pursue all legal remedies against any parties who attempt to defraud my estate through forged documents or false claims. I have provided evidence of such anticipated fraud to my friend James Caldwell, who I trust to ensure justice is served. The room fell silent except for Vivian's increasingly labored breathing. Then suddenly she collapsed to her knees beside her chair, her composure finally shattering completely. "Please," she sobbed, reaching toward me with desperate hands. "Marvin, you have to understand. I was scared. Ronald was dying, and I didn't know what would happen to me. I panicked and made terrible choices." The tears might have been genuine, but the manipulation underneath them was transparent. Even in defeat, she was calculating, trying to find an angle that might save her from complete ruin. "I'll give you half," she continued desperately. "We can work something out. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't press charges, please." I looked down at this woman who'd tormented me through my son's funeral, who'd whispered poison during his memorial service, who'd stolen from him while he lay dying. The old Marvin might have felt pity, but the man I'd become through this ordeal felt only justice. "Ronald made his wishes clear," I said quietly. "He knew exactly what kind of person you are, and so do I." Luther finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Mr. Bennett, surely we can reach some understanding. I was manipulated by Mrs. Bennett. She convinced me that Ronald wanted—" "You forged legal documents," Jimmy interrupted. "You violated your oath as an attorney. You conspired to defraud a dying man's estate." He pulled out his phone. "The FBI is very interested in white-collar crime, especially when it involves lawyers." The next few minutes blurred together in a series of official procedures. Dr. Chen documented everything for her report. Jimmy called the authorities he'd been coordinating with throughout our investigation. I signed papers acknowledging my inheritance, while Luther and Vivian sat in stunned silence, watching their carefully planned heist dissolve into criminal liability. As the legal machinery began grinding into motion around us, I opened the personal letter Ronald had left me. His handwriting was weaker than I remembered, probably from the medications, but his message was crystal clear. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means my suspicions about Vivian were correct. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. I was trying to protect you from the pain of knowing how completely I'd been deceived, but I wanted you to know that your love and support meant everything to me. Use this inheritance wisely, and know that justice has been served. Your son, Ronald." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, next to my heart. Across the table, Vivian was still crying, but her tears had turned bitter and self-pitying. Luther was making frantic phone calls, probably to criminal defense attorneys. "Mr. Bennett," Dr. Chen said, gathering her equipment, "the inheritance transfer will take some time to process through probate, but there's no question about your legal standing. Your son planned very carefully to protect his true wishes." As we prepared to leave Luther's office for the final time, I realized something important had shifted inside me. The crushing grief was still there, but it no longer felt like defeat. Ronald had protected me even in death, ensuring that justice would prevail over greed and betrayal. The last thing I saw before the elevator doors closed was Vivian staring at her hands in defeat, probably calculating how much money she'd need for legal fees instead of planning her luxurious future. Justice, it turned out, was sweeter than revenge could ever be. September sunshine filtered through the windows of my Oak Park kitchen as I read the Morning Tribune over coffee, a ritual that had finally returned to something resembling peace. 4 months had passed since that confrontation in Luther's office, and the legal system had worked with surprising efficiency once the evidence was clear. Vivian's conviction had made the business pages, 3 years for conspiracy to commit fraud, plus another 2 for the life insurance policies she'd secretly taken out on Ronald during his illness. The judge had been particularly harsh about her exploitation of a dying man's trust. Her appeals had been denied, her assets seized to pay legal fees, and her return to modeling had proven as pathetic as expected. At 40 with a criminal record, the industry had no interest in her desperation. Luther's sentence was harsher, 5 years federal prison for document forgery and violation of professional ethics. His law license had been permanently revoked, his reputation destroyed so thoroughly that even his former colleagues refused to acknowledge they'd known him. I'd heard through Jimmy that he was serving his time in a minimum security facility downstate, probably calculating how many years remained before he could attempt to rebuild some kind of life. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd conspired to steal $70 million and ended up with nothing but orange jumpsuits and criminal records. Meanwhile, I'd discovered that wealth, when earned through justice rather than greed, carried different responsibilities. The first thing I'd done was establish the Ronald Bennett Cancer Research Foundation, donating $20 million to fund the experimental treatments that might help other families avoid our tragedy. Northwestern Memorial now had a wing dedicated to innovative cancer therapies, with Ronald's photo in the lobby showing him at his best. Young, hopeful, building his first computer company. The house felt different now, too. I'd made some improvements. A new kitchen, updated heating system, fresh paint, but kept the essential character intact. This was still the home where Ronald had learned to ride his bike and built his first computer. Luxury for the sake of luxury held no appeal when I'd seen what it did to people like Vivian. Jimmy had become a regular visitor, helping me navigate the technical aspects of the foundation and occasionally joining me for the golf games we'd planned before Ronald's death. He'd never accepted any payment for his crucial role in exposing the conspiracy, claiming that friendship couldn't be bought. But I'd quietly arranged for his daughter's college fund to receive a substantial boost, ensuring she'd graduate debt-free. Mr. Bennett? The voice belonged to Sarah Martinez, the Foundation's program director. She'd called to update me on the latest research grants we'd approved. The University of Chicago team thinks they've identified a promising new approach to pancreatic cancer treatment. Early trials are showing remarkable results. Fund it, I said immediately. Whatever they need. That was the thing about having money for the right reasons. Every dollar spent on research, every breakthrough that might help another family, felt like honoring Ronald's memory in the way he would have wanted. Not through marble monuments or expensive buildings with our name on them, but through practical action that might prevent other fathers from getting that terrible phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. The garden had become my refuge during the difficult months of legal proceedings and media attention. Ronald's mother's rose bushes were thriving under my renewed care, their blooms more vibrant than they'd been in years. I'd added new plantings, too, a small memorial section with flowers that bloomed at different times throughout the year, ensuring something was always growing in Ronald's honor. As I worked among the roses that evening, I thought about the letter I'd received from a family in Wisconsin. Their 28-year-old son had been diagnosed with the same aggressive pancreatic cancer that had taken Ronald. But thanks to research funded by our foundation, he was receiving treatments that hadn't existed a year ago. His prognosis was good. That letter, more than any bank statement or legal document, proved that justice had truly been served. The phone rang as darkness settled over Oak Park. I almost didn't answer, preferring the quiet of my garden to whatever business might require attention, but something made me check the caller ID. Mr. Bennett? The voice was young, nervous. This is Dr. Patel from the research team at University of Chicago. I know it's late, but I wanted to tell you personally. The treatment protocol your foundation funded, we've just had our first complete remission. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer completely eliminated. I sat down heavily on the garden bench Ronald had built for his mother years ago. Somewhere in Chicago, a family was learning that their nightmare might have an ending different from ours, and Ronald, in his wisdom and planning, had made that possible. Doctor, I said, my voice thick with emotion, please send me everything you need for the next phase. We're going to beat this thing. After hanging up, I remained in the garden as night settled around me. The city lights twinkled in the distance, cars moving along their predictable routes, people heading home to families and lives that might now have different possibilities because of what we'd built from tragedy. Vivian had wanted money for luxury and status. Luther had wanted it for power and indulgence. But Ronald, even in death, had shown me what wealth could really accomplish when guided by love instead of greed. I touched the letter in my pocket, the one he'd written knowing he wouldn't survive to see justice done. His final gift hadn't just been the inheritance, it had been the opportunity to transform pain into purpose, loss into legacy. The roses rustled softly in the evening breeze, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday phone call, I felt genuinely at peace. Justice wasn't just about punishment for those who'd done wrong. It was about ensuring that good could triumph from the ashes of betrayal, that love could outlast even death, and that a father's final act could protect not just his own family, but countless others facing the same fight. Ronald would have been proud. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.